few days after the Imola race, hunger striker Bobby Sands died after refusing food for 66 days. By that point, there were 4 inmates of the Maze prison taking part in the strike, and a couple of days after Sands' passing, his place was taken by Joe McDonnell, with a 5th man, Brendan McLaughlin, joining the protest a week later. The British government remained unmoved. Margaret Thatcher told the House of Commons that Sands had been a common criminal who'd chosen to take his own life, quote, a choice that his organisation did not allow to many of its victims, and naturally Sands became a martyr to the Irish nationalist movement and received a funeral with full IRA military honours. It was the week of the second and final round of the French presidential election, and much hung on Jacques Chirac, who'd been eliminated in the previous round. The Communist Party had polled 4.5 million votes and would presumably vote for the centre-left Mitterrand to defeat the centre-right Giscard d'Estaing, but the divisions in the right were newer and fresher, and in the end Chirac stopped short of formally endorsing Giscard for the presidency, although he privately said he would probably vote for him. And in the final analysis, Mitterrand was elected president by a roughly 52-48 split, becoming the first socialist president since the foundation of the Fifth Republic in 1958. Hearing the news in the lounge of a hotel in the small town of Château-Chinon, in his home region of Nièvre, Mitterrand turned to his good friend and said, "Well, we've won, and now the problems begin," before heading up to his room. That friend, who'd acted as his chauffeur that evening, was Guy Ligier, and he must have been more optimistic about what the result meant for his own Formula One team. The day after the election, the latest Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, Cats, opened in London's West End, a production directed by noted Shakespearean director Trevor Nunn, who also co-wrote the song lyrics. The cast included Brian Blessed in the twin roles of Old Deuteronomy and Bustopher Jones, Paul Nicholas as Rum Tum Tugger, child star Bonnie Langford as Rumpelteazer, and dancer Wayne Sleep as Mr. Mistopheles, with Elaine Page as Grisabella, and thus getting the breakout hit Memory. While Lloyd Webber had had musical hits before, Joseph and His Amazing Technicolor Raincoat in 1968, Jesus Christ Superstar in 1970, and Evita in 1976, Cats was on another level of success, running non-stop for 21 years in the West End, and when it transferred to Broadway in 1982, it broke all records in pre-sales. Just don't mention the 2019 movie. And then, just as the teams were all packing up their kit in their transporters to head to Belgium, someone shot the Pope. Back in 1979, an Islamic fundamentalist group had taken control of the Grand Mosque of Mecca for 2 weeks in protest at what they saw as the Saudi government's secularist policies and friendliness with the West. While that was going on, there was a planned visit to Turkey by the newly elected Pope John Paul II, and one Mehmet Ali Adja, a member of ultranationalist group the Grey Wolves, went to the newspapers and said he would kill the Pope if he didn't call off the visit. Adja had already murdered the editor of Turkish newspaper Milliyet and been sprung from his life imprisonment, so he was taken seriously. The papal visit went off without problems, but Adja was preparing, and in May 1981 he was waiting in St. Peter's Square when the Pope passed by. He pulled out a gun and fired twice before he was wrestled to the ground. The Pope was injured but survived, and when Adja was sentenced again to life imprisonment, this time in Italy, the pontiff publicly forgave him and pressured the Italian president to pardon and release him, which was finally done in the year 2000. The Pope kept in contact with Adja throughout his imprisonment, and the Turk later said that he'd converted to Christianity in prison. After John Paul II's death in 2005 and subsequent canonization in 2014, Adja visited the Vatican again and paid his respects, though requests to meet Popes Francis I and Leo XIV have perhaps understandably been declined. And so to Belgium. The Belgian Grand Prix was one of the original great races, going back to the Grande Épreuve of the interwar years. From the first Belgian Grand Prix in 1925 through until 1970, with one exception in 1946, the race was held on the 15-kilometre 9.3-mile Spa-Francorchamps circuit in the rolling Ardennes Hills. Like the Nürburgring in Germany, Spa was known as a very quick circuit along public roads, challenging but stunning. But as cars got faster and faster, drivers started to balk at the complete lack of any safety measures. The 1969 race was cancelled while the circuit owners made some grudging amendments, but it wasn't enough, and after one more race in 1970, the Belgian Automobile Club were looking for a new venue. It was originally felt that if the race was going to move away from its traditional home, it should alternate between tracks in the French and Flemish parts of Belgium. A brand new circuit was built at Nivelles-Bollé just outside Brussels for the francophone end of the deal, but it was immensely unpopular, flat, featureless and boring, and only hosted the 1971 and 73 races before the race moved permanently to the Zolder circuit just outside Hasselt. That had been designed in 1963 by John Hugenholtz, and with a couple of minor tweaks remained basically unchanged ever since. In the weeks between races, the FISA Technical Commission had met to talk about how to apply the new regulations outlawing ground effect. According to the text of the Concord Agreement, any device filling the gap between the bodywork and the ground is prohibited, and the Commission now stated that a rectangular piece made of a uniform and solid material may be attached to the bottom of the side body panels. No suspension height adjustment device may allow the car, in its lowest position, to have a ground clearance of less than 6 centimetres. And so, F1 designers did what they do, and interpreted the rules in the most advantageous way for them, and many cars appeared in Belgium with skirts made of rubber, which was a solid material in the sense of it not being a liquid or a gas. And as to the suspension height adjusters, well, just as previously, if you can only measure it while it's standing still, all you need to do is make sure it obeys the rules when it's standing still. It didn't seem like that problem was going away anytime soon. But now the organisers had a new headache. The Concord Agreement stipulated a maximum of 30 cars could enter qualifying, and had eliminated the pre-qualifying session sometimes used in the past to get the numbers down. But now, with the return to the paddock of Lotus, there were 32 entrants. ATS had brought their new chassis for Borgud, with Lammers still driving the old car, and on Thursday decided just to not bother with the old one and withdrew the Dutchman's entry, so that was one less to worry about. The Ozella, Theodore and Tolman teams were all non-FOCA affiliated, and thus could potentially have a driver kicked out by FISA without getting into another faction fight, but Tolman were a turbo team and FISA wanted to keep them sweet, while Ozella were under Ferrari's protection, so it was Patrick Tambay who was informed that he wouldn't be taking part on Friday, with Ferrari's Marco Piccinini trying to get the team banned until the end of the year to reduce grid congestion. By now, there were only 5 teams without some kind of dynamic suspension: Theodore, Ozella, March, Tolman and McLaren, while Renault were debuting their new car, the RE30, with a shorter wheelbase and lower-mounted turbos to improve weight distribution. Ligier were continuing to evolve their car. Matra had solved a tricky fuel supply issue that had been hampering the engines, while their version of the trick suspension used the oil pressure from the V12 engine to control the height. Articulated skirts, not technically flexible but jointed, were one step too far though, and the FOCA teams managed to get them ruled illegal. Lotus had started work on adapting the stillborn 88 into a more conventional new car, but they were in desperate need of sponsorship still, and they weren't going to raise it if they weren't racing, so they were back in Belgium with their aging 81Bs, still in Essex branding, though Chapman was reportedly talking to his old backers Imperial Tobacco, whose black and gold JPS liveries had been so iconic of the team in the 70s. ATS's new car looked promising too. The HGS1, designed by Hervé Gilpin and Tim Wardrop, had a completely new body shape, and the now de rigueur hydrodynamic suspension. March had another new version of their car with the redesigned front end, while at Fittipaldi comparative tyre tests were ongoing, Rosberg continuing here with Avon, while Serra reverted to Michelin. And with Miguel Angel Guerra still in hospital with a broken leg and expected to be out for at least 4 months, Enzo Ozella needed a replacement, and after considering Giorgio Francia, who drove for his sports car team and had had a single Grand Prix for Brabham in 1977, he decided to give a debut to Lancia and Alfa Romeo development driver Piercarlo Ghinzani. Car 31, Piercarlo Ghinzani. Born just outside Bergamo in 1952, Ghinzani was the son of a machine shop owner and started out racing motorbikes in his teens before switching to 4 wheels and entering Italian Formula Ford, and by 1973, Formula 3. Lacking much in the way of sponsorship, he always struggled for competitive machinery, scoring a few points here and there as he tried to get recognised among a very competitive field. In 1976 he finally had a breakthrough, one of 3 title contenders along with Riccardo Patrese and Gianfranco Brancatelli, all 3 arriving at the last race with a chance of winning. On the opening lap, Ghinzani collided with Brancatelli and bounced off into retirement, ending his title hopes, but when Gianfranco then chucked it off in pursuit of Patrese, the win and the title, Ghinzani did at least finish second in the standings. He'd also finished 11th overall in the European F3 Series, and in 1977 he took the European title himself, despite his team collapsing mid-season. It was the first time a March chassis had won the European F3 Series. Formula 2 proved to be back to struggling, scoring just 1 points finish all year in 1978 with the Euro Racing team. But Euro Racing were the Alfa Romeo Works team, and they made Piquet an offer. If he dropped back down to European F3 and won the series with them, he'd be taken on as a permanent staff driver. After the first race, which he won, he was approached by Jean-Marie Balestre and informed that, since he was so much more experienced than everyone else, he would not be eligible for points that season. A move Ghinzani always suspected was intended to ease Alain Prost's progress to the title that year. He changed his plans, entered and won the Italian F3 Series instead at the expense of Michele Alboreto, and was duly hired on as an Alfa Romeo engine development driver, and was also hired by Cesare Fiorio, who ran the Lancia sports car team, to develop and occasionally drive the Beta Monte Carlo. And that's what he was doing when Enzo Arzella gave him a ring a week before the Belgian Grand Prix, and it can't have taken him long to decide, even if he'd never sat in an F1 car before. Off they all went on Friday afternoon for qualifying, well, all except for a fuming Patrick Tambay, with the stewards checking the 6cm ground clearance as they came back in, and several drivers failed to check and had their time struck off, but were allowed to make the car compliant and try again. About 10 minutes before the end of the session, Carlos Reutemann set the fastest time of the day, but as he came back down the pit lane, a young Arzella mechanic, Giovanni Amadeo, one of Ghinzani's crew, fell off the pit wall directly into his path and was hit by the Williams. He was rushed to hospital with a fractured skull and had to be resuscitated in the ambulance. It was the last straw for many, drivers and mechanics alike, who'd been complaining for some time about the number of people who were in the pit lane, even during races, something very obvious in the pit lane footage from the previous race at Imola, who were, as James Hunt put it, hangers-on, there to see and be seen rather than actually there to do a job. The problem was particularly acute at Zolder, which had quite a narrow pit lane and a pit wall just a foot wide. As for Reutemann, he was interviewed by the police as a matter of course, and while nobody attached any blame to him, he was clearly deeply affected and told reporters that he was going to try and pack it away until Monday and think about it then. Derek Warwick had blown his engine on Friday and his car was sportingly withdrawn that evening, which would allow Patrick Tambay to enter Saturday qualifying after all. And René Arnoux was also setting his hopes on Saturday, as he'd broken his new car, gone off the road in the old one, and ended the day 25th and off the grid. But just as the session was about to begin, it started raining, and although it stopped again after half an hour or so, nobody was going quicker. There were some, like legendary motorsport journalist Dennis Jenkinson, who suggested that, as so many other rules in F1 seemed so flexible these days, perhaps Saturday's qualification could have been delayed a couple of hours to allow the track to dry off, but apparently some rules were immutable. Carlos Reutemann then was on pole position, with Piquet alongside, and Pironi and Patrese sharing row 2, the Frenchman's Ferrari benefiting from the team's new trick suspension, as did the Italian's Arrows. Watson put the McLaren MP4, which didn't have the trick suspension, 5th on the grid, while Jones had to settle for 6th after his best time was chalked off when his ride height switch didn't return when he came back to the pits. Villeneuve had the traditional suspension and was back in 7th, alongside a surprising Eddie Cheever, another driver whose car had been improved by his use of the hydrodynamic suspension. Lafitte was 9th, having had his best time chalked off too. In his case, he'd blown his engine on the way back into the pits, and of course the Ligier suspension relied on the oil pressure from the engine. And Mansell was a very creditable 10th in the understeery Lotus 81. Arnoux was not alone in having problems with the new Renault. Prost could only manage 12th, while Storer achieved his best grid position of 13th. Sura, an equally commendable 16th in the underfunded Ensign. Alfa Romeo had brought 3 different ride height systems, and none of them worked. Their cars were back in 17th and 18th. Rebaque blew an engine and only managed 21st, and both Azellas qualified again, alongside De Cesaris in the old M29 on the back row would be debutant Piercarlo Ghinzani, keen to do well on behalf of his mechanic Amadeo as well as himself. The new ATS clearly wasn't quite there yet, likewise the March, though Daly might have done better if all of his times hadn't been chalked off, having failed the ride height exam despite not actually using dodgy suspension, but nobody told the team, so the car just kept running without making any changes. Having failed to qualify, a furious René Arnoux stormed off after Saturday's session, got into the little Renault 5 Turbo the team had for his personal use, shot off at full chat, and wove past all the spectators' cars queuing to get out of the circuit to the junction with the main road. And Marshall wasn't having that, walked out into the road in front of René and held up his hand to stop him. Arnoux started to rev the engine an inch forward, so the Marshal sat on his bonnet. And Arnoux promptly took off like a scolded cat, Marshall clinging on by the windscreen wipers as a still livid Arnoux drove at F1 speeds the 10 minutes back to the hotel, where he abandoned the car as it now dawned that he was probably in trouble, and he went and hid in the kitchen. Unsurprisingly, the police turned up not long afterwards, by which time most of the rest of the drivers had returned too, and as it happened, Alain Prost was in the lobby when they arrived. When asked for Monsieur Arnoux, Alain waggishly took them to see a bemused Jacques Lafitte, but eventually René was located and taken off to spend Saturday night in a cell, contemplating the meaning of the phrase causing death by dangerous driving and how it could nearly have applied to him. So, as the grid began to assemble on Sunday lunchtime, there was a distinctly tense and bad-tempered atmosphere around the place. Incidentally, I'm working off 3 different sets of footage here. The BBC highlights package, which is pretty good quality, but obviously doesn't include all of the action. An Austrian ORF broadcast, which is live and in full, but not as good a picture, and cuts off before the end. And Rai's Italian broadcast, which looks awful, but does actually go all the way to the end of the race. A group of mechanics, and Jody Scheckter in his role as the head of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, had indicated their intention to protest. Both the race organisers and Bernie Eccleston with his FOCA hat on, though, had been very clear that the race would start at 3 p.m. no matter what, and several of the FOCA team owners threatened penalties if any of their own staff took part. So when people started moving forward toward the front of the grid before the parade lap, it ended up looking as if it was a solely Franco-Italian protest with the British teams not taking part. With people still milling around on the grid and not all the drivers back in their cars, the organisers gave the signal to set off for the parade lap, but instead of signalling Reutemann off first, Piquet was sent away, then Reutemann, then Jones from 6th, then Watson, Cheever, Mansell, De Angelis and the rest as and when they were ready. It was total chaos, as drivers were unsure if they would be penalised for getting back to their proper position on the parade lap, so they arrived on the grid out of order. Assuming not unreasonably that there would be another formation lap, Piquet pulled ahead of his grid slot and was sent round again, but nobody else was. As Nelson was making his way back round, the remaining cars arrived, often having to be pushed back into their slots, but the delay was now causing more problems. Reutemann called Frank Williams over, his engine was beginning to overheat. Piquet finally arrived, wove his way to the front and was pushed into position, but now Patrese was also waving his arms urgently. His own engine had now stalled. It was obvious that there would have to be a new warm-up lap and a lap struck off the race distance, so Patrese's mechanic Dave Luckett hopped off the pit wall with a can of compressed air, just as race director Derek Ongaro hit the button for the green light and everyone tore off the line. With everyone slicing right to left in front of him, Storr moved the other way and slammed into the back of his teammate's car and the unfortunate Luckett. As everyone else headed off round lap 1, Luckett lay inert on the ground and a visibly distraught Storr leapt out of his cockpit, convinced he'd just killed his colleague. As marshals waved yellow flags and the ambulance was called. It was obvious there would have to be a red flag, with 2 Formula 1 cars, an injured man and an ambulance now on the start-finish straight, but it hadn't come out by the time Piquet arrived at full speed to find the straight full of people and yellow flags. And several drivers nearly bowled over marshals as they pulled out unsighted to make overtaking manoeuvres, only to hurriedly pull back in again. Piquet had got through fairly easily, so he hadn't really grasped how bad the situation was, and blasted round lap 2 with Reutemann in pursuit, but then the ambulance carrying Dave Luckett set off around the circuit on its way to the exit, which bunched everyone else up behind it. As Piquet and Reutemann, still not seeing any red flags, went through to start lap 3 at full racing speed, Pironi in third took an executive decision and slowed right down as he came past the crowd of marshals, wove side to side to stop anyone else passing him, and then he and Jones pulled up side by side on the start line, with yellow-shirted Ferrari mechanics swarming onto the track applauding and cheering, and at the end of the third lap, Piquet and Reutemann also joined the back of the queue. And so there would need to be a restart after all. Presumably the organisers, under pressure from the TV schedules, had wanted to avoid the short delay of a new parade lap, but now had an even longer and more bad-tempered one, as everyone was pushed back into their assigned grid slots, except for the 2 Arrows drivers, the team having rather lost interest in proceedings. It was 40 minutes before they were ready to go again after a rather more organised formation lap. So off they went for a second go, Reutemann this time holding Piquet off, only for Pironi to nip through the inside and take the lead. He'd done the same thing here in his Ligier last year and gone on to take his maiden win. Problems again for Prost, though, as he'd started with the old RE20B, burned out the clutch and trailed in to retire, again, as Pironi led everyone around the first lap. Reutemann, Piquet, Watson, Jones and Villeneuve in the points, chased by Lafitte, Rosberg, Mansell and Cheever. Jones took fourth off Watson on lap 2, and shortly after, Lafitte, something of a Zolder specialist himself, nabbed sixth off Villeneuve. Pironi seemed to be holding the others up in the initial laps, with Reutemann, Piquet and Jones all queued up behind him, though Watson was dropping back and having to fend off Lafitte. As usual, the Ferrari handled like soup in the corners, but had enough grunt along the straights to keep everyone behind him, so it was left to the Brabham and the two Williamses to jockey for position and wait to see if the Ferrari broke down. Jones at the back of the group setting an early fastest lap as he tried to put pressure on Piquet. On lap 10, Pironi caught a slide in the Lucien Bianchi bocht, causing Reutemann to lift, and Piquet said thank you very much and nipped through into second, with Jones following through at the chicane. By now at least some good news was filtering through to the paddock. Arrow's mechanic Dave Luckett had suffered 2 broken legs and a broken arm and was understandably looking a bit the worse for wear, but was not in danger of his life. Jabouille pulled in at the Ligier pit with a repeat of his Imola misfire. His 50th Grand Prix, like that of Renault, looked like it would be one to forget. His teammate Lafitte was still hanging onto the back of Watson's MP4, while Rosberg pulled out as his gear lever had come loose in his hand. Pironi was still struggling with the evil handling of his car, and on lap 11 he went over the curbs at the Kleiner chicane, kicking up a cloud of dust from which Lafitte emerged ahead of Watson, who'd also bounced over the grass. While the cameras were watching De Cesaris pull in to have his gearbox looked at, Piquet had a slight slide at the Jochen Rindt bocht, and Jones tried to pounce, got it all wrong and punted the Brabham into the catch fencing. A furious Piquet would not be taking the championship lead today, and still had yet to finish a race at Zolder in 3 attempts. Pironi, whose brakes were now also starting to go, had Jones and Reutemann right behind him as they approached Jabouille to lap him. Jean-Pierre got well out of the way of the top 3 and his own teammate in 4th, just as Pironi completely missed his braking at the second corner and the Williams duo both piled through, with Lafitte now also tucked up behind his former teammate and through soon afterwards. De Cesaris would go no further, his gearbox gremlins terminal, and with Jones now leading Reutemann at the front, it looked like we were in for another instalment in the Williams teammate drama, while Watson was now closing in on Pironi in turn, with Villeneuve and the low tie of Mansell and De Angelis in tow. While Lafitte set a new fastest lap in pursuit of the Williams twins, Jabouille was back in again. Very different fortunes for the two Ligier drivers. Kinzani continued having a dramatic debut. Unseen by the cameras, his rear wing disintegrated and fell off on the start-finish straight, pitching him into the catch fencing at turn 1. He was in a dangerous spot, so the marshals pushed him backwards and he got moving again, tiptoeing back round to the pits to see if they had a spare. They did, and he would rejoin the race 4 laps down. Jones, meanwhile, was commanding in the lead, setting a new fastest lap as he tried to build a lead over Reutemann, but going into the Lucien Bianchi bocht on lap 20, he suddenly found himself in neutral and went straight on into the tyre wall. The impact ruptured his radiator too, spraying boiling water all over the Aussie's legs and scalding him, which didn't improve his mood any as he limped away. It was, incredibly, the first Williams retirement since the 1980 Monaco Grand Prix a year ago. While the cameras were watching the Williams being craned away, Mansell had got ahead of Watson, and then Pironi had another moment and both Brits came piling through. Third was by some distance the highest Mansell had ever been in a Grand Prix, and even if he went out now, Colin Chapman could take some cheer from his progress. Reutemann, meanwhile, now had a lead of some 10 seconds over Lafitte, who was in turn about 5 ahead of Mansell. Villeneuve and De Angelis were soon past Pironi too, and next in the queue was Hector Ribacca, who'd quietly been having a storming race to make his way up to 8th from 21st on the grid, and had Cheever on his tail. Behind them in 10th was Sura on his first visit to Zolder. Serra, already driving with a nasty dose of flu that was impairing his balance, came in when his engine also started sounding sick. He got going again, but not for long, and Cheever got past Ribacca off camera before also disposing of an ailing Pironi, but the race seemed to have petered out rather, as Lafitte maintained his gap to Reutemann ahead and Mansell behind. Reutemann, for his part, looked unassailable in the lead, lapping his former Lotus teammate and 1978 world champion Mario Andretti on lap 38, just after half distance, as Jabouille made yet another stop, but the sky was starting to cloud over and anxious glances were being cast. Jabouille finally gave it up as a bad job after his sixth stop on lap 45, while it turned out that Rybak's sudden decline in performance had been due to brake problems, and on lap 40 they failed entirely, sending him off the track and out of the race. So on lap 45 the order was Reutemann leading Lafitte by 22.7 seconds, with Mansell third, another 13 seconds back, Watson 3 seconds behind him in fourth, then Villeneuve and De Angelis running together not far behind the McLaren and providing what excitement there was on the track. Watson started having gearbox problems of his own and dropped behind the pair, with Cheever now also approaching. And then, on lap 50, the first drops of rain started to fall. Teams started rolling grooved tyres out and opening umbrellas in the pits, but nobody was stopping quite yet as they waited to see what would transpire. Cheever got past Watson as the cameras caught a Williams mechanic heading to the pit wall with a Saudi flag, because as Reutemann came round to complete lap 55...
He's going to have to make his mind up. What? That's the checkered flag, and that's 55 laps. I cannot believe it. There's 15 laps to go, and the race has been stopped. I can't. Surely the finishing flag official couldn't have. No, you can't possibly mistake 15 laps.
The organisers had decided, in typically shambolic fashion, that with two-thirds distance completed, meaning the race would count for full points, the rain afforded an excellent excuse to bring the whole sorry weekend to a close. The results would be taken from the end of lap 54, which was good for Eddie Cheever because he'd blown his engine on lap 55. Carlos Reutemann dutifully took to the top step of the podium, flanked by Lafitte and Mansell. On any other weekend it would have been a pretty happy place. Reutemann's 12th win meant he had scored points in every single race for the last calendar year. Williams celebrated their 50th race with a win, in stark contrast to Renault. Jacques Lafitte got his season up and running after a dreadful start, and Nigel Mansell had his first podium place, part of a double points finish for the beleaguered Lotus team. But all three men looked like they would rather be anywhere else, and the teams and drivers mostly couldn't get away from the circuit quick enough. The morning after the race, it was announced that, after having been in a coma since the accident, Giovanni Amadeo's life support had been switched off in the early hours of Sunday morning, and that he had died at the age of 22. He'd begun his career at 18 with Arturo Mezzario's team, and when that folded at the end of 1979, he was hired by Ozella, initially for their sports car operation at the latter end of 1980, and then moving into the Formula One team. On the Facebook post where I found this picture, there were comments by Beppe Gabbiani recalling that Amadeo had fastened his seatbelts that day and sent him off with encouraging words, and Beppe dedicated his autobiography to him.